California's election results signal a shift toward more progressive public policies on everything from crime to taxes. It also ushered in new Democratic supermajorities in both houses of the California legislature. What are the public policy implications? We'll ask John Myers, Sacramento bureau chief with the Los Angeles Times, and Marisa Lagos with the California Politics and Government Desk for KQED. California's 2016 election, political sea change or political mirage?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Well, there was lots of talk, actually consternation, about the 17 propositions on the California ballot. When the smoke cleared, Californians seem to have done a U-turn on some important public policy issues ranging from crime to taxes. So what are the implications? We're fortunate to have two insightful folks on state politics with us today, John Myers from the LA Times and Marisa Lagos from KQED. Welcome.
Thank you.
So John, I'll start with you.
Yep.
Lots of big tax and spend issues on the ballot. There was a $9 billion bond for K-12. That passed. There was a tax extension on the wealthy. That passed. There was a $2 cigarette tax. That passed. And requiring voter approval for bonds, that didn't pass, which the governor didn't want that to pass. So what gives?
I don't know. I mean, Californians, I think Californians were somewhat in a generous mood, I guess, if you look at it that way, Mark, when you roll it down that way. I mean, most notable out of that would say were the two tax measures, the cigarette tax measure and the income tax measure. Let's take the income tax first, Prop 55. There was no...
The temporary tax.
The temporary tax, right, which adds 12 years to a 6-year tax, which makes it an 18-year tax if, in fact, that is temporary. But there was no well-funded opposition to that income tax. I think that was a big deal. And then on the tobacco tax, that was a very close race 4 years ago to raise the tobacco tax, and Big Tobacco won. This time they didn't win. And I think in large part because they had a well-funded yes on the tobacco tax campaign, mainly by Tom Steyer, a big Democratic activist.
So it's money talks. I mean, interesting, look at the big pharma measure that they were fighting against in terms of drug prices. Big Pharma won. They knocked it back, and they spent $109 million.
But that's a different situation. That was a very confusing measure. There was a lot of uncertainty about its implications, and they spent more than I think anybody's ever spent on a ballot measure in California. So money does talk. But I think on the cigarette tax, it talked, you don't have to maybe spend the same amount as tobacco companies, but when you match them $2 for $1 compared to 4 years ago, it works. I think people like taxing people who aren't themselves.
Right. I think it's a good, because the cigarette tax, 12% of Californians smoke, so it's getting a smaller and smaller group.
And the income tax is on the highest earners in California. You've got to have taxable income of about $250,000 for a single filer, $500,000 for a joint filer. That is not the biggest chunk of taxpayers in California. It's easier to tax them.
Don't tax me, tax the guy behind the tree. So let's talk about another proposition, the one legalizing recreational use of marijuana. You could argue that's a revenue issue as much as a cultural issue. But a similar prop like that just a few years ago was turned down. This time it passed. Well, what changed this time, Marisa?
I think culturally, the narrative has shifted. We've seen other states legalize it. It's become a lot more sort of, even though marijuana on a medical basis has been legal for 2 decades, it's been accepted a little more, I think, in recent years. This one was very carefully crafted. Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom was behind it. There was a lot of money behind it. I think it was a more sort of mainstream measure, and they tried ahead of time in the way they wrote it to sort of curb a lot of the criticisms they got the last time around. But I think in general, it's just the narrative is shifting nationally on this issue. I think that, with the Trump administration, we're not going to see a lot of laying off of those prosecutions. But if you look at what voters think, not just in California, but nationally, the attitude's just changed in recent years.
Money, though, driving this a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think Marisa's exactly right, but let's talk about the money just briefly. Newsom was involved, but Sean Parker, the former co-president president, I should say, of Facebook, and the guy who founded Napster, put a lot of money into it. This was a road-tested ballot measure, unlike the one a few years ago. They had 1 million blue ribbon commissions and town halls and discussions. It was a 17,000-word document. And I think key to it also is that it has a tax structure for state tax money, local tax monies, if local jurisdictions allow pot shops to open up there. I think that is a big part too. Again, revenue helps get past maybe
up
some
to
of
$1 billion,
the
Elliot was saying.
Yeah. Revenue and local control. They gave cities and counties the ability to essentially opt out of this on a lot of ways, and I think that again headed off opposition. Law enforcement were the only big sort of pushback, and they didn't have the money to fight it.
Well, let me ask John. Let me ask you this about the tough on crime measures that we saw in the 80s and 90s. Seem to have been voters seem to be turning away from those. You've got they passed criminal sentencing reform this year. They also placed some restrictions on ammunition sales. But then again, they didn't go for a repeal of the death penalty, and they actually wanted to speed up the death penalty. What's going on here?
I think I would take death penalty and set it to the side. I think most people you'll talk to will say that there are different issues for the voters there. There's a morality issue. There's a longer issue. People wrestle with it in their conscience differently. The expediting of the death penalty one, on the other hand, I think there could have been some confusion out there. But the two you've mentioned are really interesting. The gun measure, which kind of reaffirms what the legislature did last year about background checks for ammunition. And then Prop 57, which Marisa and I both covered, which I think is a really fascinating measure. Again, didn't have a big opposition campaign in terms of money. I mean, law enforcement was there, but they didn't have the money. And the governor's campaign about parole and rethinking parole and a second chance for people who aren't the most violent offenders. I think it's a really sweeping, long-range change in criminal justice in the state.
What message were the voters sending with those criminal justice measures?
I think we have seen a real embracing of sort of rejecting the tough on crime measures that did pass, over the last 2 decades. There was
3 strikes seems so many years ago.
And it was. It was not that long ago, though, that voters rejected the first attempt to reform that, and Jerry Brown was out front opposing that reform, and now he's embraced it. A lot of it had to do with crowding in prisons and money that we've been spending. But I think in general, you've seen successful reforms in years past that haven't led to the crime increase, at least from a lot of people's perspective, and so people are willing to embrace this and give people a second chance.
Okay, well, when we come back, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Trump effect in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Democrats are in control of state government and the Republicans are in control of the federal government. So what gives? What are the implications? We're talking with Marisa Lagos, who reports on state politics for KQED's California Politics and Government Desk, and John Myers, Sacramento Bureau Chief for the LA Times. So Marisa, let me ask you, let's start with immigration, an issue, perhaps the key issue in the campaign. What are we likely to see going forward?
Well, the biggest thing that I think cities, counties, and even the entire state is bracing themselves for is attempts to cut funding based on the sanctuary policies that we have here in California. These are things like the Statewide Trust Act, which basically limit how much sheriffs are allowed to cooperate with federal immigration and customs enforcement over when they bring somebody into a jail. Maybe they're ready to release them, but they have an immigration hold. Do they hold that person? Do they not? And so basically the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress are threatening to cut off funding for these sanctuary jurisdictions. Whether they can do that, I think is an open question. There's already law enforcement grants that the Obama administration and the Republican-controlled Congress have moved to restrict, but there's a lot of other areas of funding, obviously, both at the state and local level, and so they're gonna be pushing back hard on these what they see as sort of weak on immigration policy.
There's lots of money involved here.
There's a lot of money, and I think it's it's important that you look at what local communities are going to do. The sanctuary issue is huge, and then you match it with what the state government's going to do. And we saw right out of the gate, very first day of the legislature in December, with Democratic leaders saying we're going to fight, we're drawing a line. I mean, a key issue that they put on the table is taxpayer dollars to fund the legal services in deportation hearings of those who are undocumented. I think that is a huge issue. I think the real question is, how much does the Trump administration do, how fast? And does California want to sit and wait or be proactive? If you look at the governor in his early comments, he says, let's wait and see. If you hear Democrats in the state capitol, and maybe some in local communities, they're like a fight mentality. I think it's going to be interesting.
Right out of the blocks. Let's turn to another issue that's not that divisive, Obamacare. Big issue in the campaign. Implications for California.
Huge, absolutely
20
huge.
billion?
Yeah, 15 billion safely, maybe more. No state was more aggressive at implementing the Affordable Care Act than California. We have 5 million people who are covered with health care now who weren't before, most of those in Medi-Cal, which is health care for the working poor. But Covered California, the state's health exchange, also has a chunk of those people. Big implications. I think the real question is how fast does Washington act, since they've said they're going to repeal it? Right. And then how many years and how long does California have to do something, money and
will there be something in place when they repeal it?
Right, and I mean, it's interesting though, because the biggest hit would be Medicare, and that is actually something that they have a lot of leeway in terms of changing the way they put that money to states. They want to change to a block grant system instead of these matching funds. That could be very harmful to California's budget. And that's not something that will necessarily impact the 2017-18 budget, but I think going forward it's going to be a big deal.
But they're talking about a block grant based on pre-Obamacare numbers, yes. Which is a big difference because there's 3.7 million Californians enrolled in Medi-Cal. So that could have some big financial implications. Let me ask you about another small issue, John, climate change. A small issue.
How much time you got?
Right. We've got about 30 seconds. No, it's a seminal issue for the governor and the legislature. Yeah. What's going to happen?
I would put that one last of the other two, if for no other reason than California went its own way for a decade. When the Bush administration was there and California wanted to be more aggressive, I think California can play offense more than defense on climate change. But yes, there are these efforts about clean burning plants, coal-fired plants around the country. The Trump administration may roll that back. California may even again be on its own island on trying to advance
Back to the future?
Which is interesting, yeah, given the fact that one of the governor's things that he plans to push next year is, or did before Trump went, I haven't talked to him since, but is this idea of sort of expanding our electric grid to include other Western states. If Trump is really pushing more coal or other dirty sources, is he going to still want to go that road? I don't know. But I do think that, to John's point, it has less sort of impact on the bottom line in California because we have already been doing it, and a lot of these issues are not necessarily tied to our state budget. However, clean energy is a huge sector, and so I think it'll be really interesting to see if this businessman wants to undercut something that offers more jobs now to Americans than coal does.
Yeah. I was going to say, just on that point, here in December, Google announced that they are in 2017 going to be 100% renewable energy in their entire business plan everywhere they go. Governor was touting it here in early December. Again, back to the business versus environmental match here. And the governor, I think, is ready to take on the president-elect if that issue comes up.
Well, I want to ask you this, Marisa. What do you think the Trump presidency is going to have on the beleaguered Republican Party in California? Is it going to reinvigorate them, or is it going to push them down even further?
I think it could actually have the latter effect. I mean, if you look at the voting numbers, if you look at the sort of where folks are at, whether they're Democrats or independents or even some Republicans in California, if these sorts of initiatives go through to really cut off funding to punish states like California, I don't know that that's going to help Republicans here. That said, there's a lot of safe Republican congressional districts where Democrats thought they might have made some leeway this year because of how unpopular Trump was, and they didn't get anywhere. So we'll see, but I don't think it looks good, for example, for the 2018 governor's race.
Yeah. So what do you think, John, about the Republican Party?
I think it's going to be a tough time. I mean, look at this. Donald Trump got almost half the votes Hillary Clinton did in California. I think that's a very big hole to dig out of, especially for a state Republican Party that's been struggling.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the new faces in state politics in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with KQED's Marisa Lagos and John Myers from the LA Times about the November election. Well, John, the Democrats squeaked out a supermajority in both houses of the California legislature. Is it that super?
You know, this is the great debate, right? I mean, is it? I mean, let's say this at first. If this had been the old days when it took a 2/3 vote in both houses to pass a budget, this would be huge because you needed Republican votes. It was ostensibly bipartisan, good deference to Mr. Maddy in the name of this program, but it usually was contentious and a big giant fight. Now the supermajority is a much smaller thing. I think there's some symbolism, but I do think in the early days of this legislative session we've seen something fascinating. Democrats wanting to use the supermajority for an urgency bill. What's an urgency bill? A bill that takes effect immediately, becomes law immediately. An urgency on anti-Trump immigration policy, for example. That's a place where the supermajority, I think, has a little bit of power. Otherwise, it's a feel-good, I think, for Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be that much easier to convince moderate Democrats from, say, the Central Valley to support tax increases or maybe even, crack down on oil consumption, as we've seen in years past. But it could make majority bills easier to get to, right? For very contentious issues, maybe things like law enforcement reform, where there's been a lot of it's been hard to get there to 41 in the Assembly in particular. So I don't think, we're going to see them go hog wild with taxes. Let's not forget Jerry Brown's still in the governor's office. But there are things that it's going to make a difference. And I think symbolically, they like it.
Well, let's talk about the mods for a little bit, those business-friendly Democrats. With the fading prospects of the California Republican Party, are they going to become the new opposition?
They have, I think. I mean, I think that's already happened. I think this is why it's so interesting to see where the party itself has decided to put its resources during recent elections, because a lot of times they're supporting Democrats that maybe voted with them less than some of the moderate Republicans they're trying to defeat. So yes, I think that that's going to be a real big challenge, especially for the Speaker, Anthony Rendon, who just took his office last March. I think they've really played more in the Assembly in the last couple of years, but it remains to be seen. I think it'll be a challenge for Kevin De Leon in the Senate as well.
The mods have an interesting role. They're kind of like a third liberal Democrats, third these business Democrats, and a third Republicans. It seems like it kind of breaks down in a way, isn't it? I mean, they're playing an important role there.
Well, the first thing is, I mean, they call themselves the mods. I try to avoid that term a little bit because I don't know.
Like Mod Squad?
Well, no, because I mean, moderate to what? I mean, who's to the right of them in the Democratic Party? There's not anyone. They're business-aligned Democrats. They're focused on business and economic issues in a way that's different than Democratic Party orthodoxy. On social issues, they're lined up with other Democrats, I think. I think a key area to watch is going to be transportation at the beginning of this legislative session, because transportation stalled, I guess pun intended there, in 2016 because of a gas tax, which would take a 2/3 vote. And one of the leaders of the Mod Caucus, Assemblyman Jim Cooper of Sacramento, I talked to on the very beginning of this, and he said, I don't know about that gas tax increase. It depends on how it's crafted. And that's, again, where you see these Democrats who are kind of averse to taxes are going to have to wrestle with the issues.
But on that issue, it's interesting because one of the biggest proponents of some sort of transportation deal is the business community. Right? So do they listen to them? Is it more, we're just sort of not comfortable with taxes? And like you said, I mean, he's not jumping on board, but he's giving an opening to say it depends on how it's crafted, as opposed to Republicans who just say no taxes.
Now, there's an alliance there between the unions and companies who might want to see these transportation things move forward. Let me ask you this, Marisa, about we have a new U.S. Senator from California, former California AG Kamala Harris. She's been replaced by Governor Brown by Xavier Becerra, new AG. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this was an interesting and somewhat surprising choice for the governor, but a smart one. Becerra is going to be, if he's confirmed, the first Latino Attorney General. He comes from D.C. after spending 24 years there, and so he understands the way that Congress functions. He understands potentially sort of what the Republican Congress and Trump are going to be doing to push back on some of the issues that we've discussed around California. And I think that he also is very well respected, well known in Los Angeles, which is a huge population center, obviously, and he knows how to raise money. He's been in Congress for 2 decades. So,
what are your thoughts on the
There's
appointment?
almost no one who thinks that Xavier Becerra was a bad pick for Governor Brown, for the reasons that Marisa says, and for the simple fact
perhaps
that,
some folks in the Trump administration.
Well, but I was going to say, for the simple fact that he meets the goal of a lot of Democrats in 2 ways. One, he's the right face. He has the right story, son of Mexican immigrants. And secondly, he knows the Attorney General's office. He was a Deputy Attorney General to John Van de Kamp before he was in the legislature and in Congress, and he may know how to work the levers of power. And an Attorney General is a huge part of the fight if California is going to have it with the Trump administration.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the future of California politics, new faces and whatnot. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So what does 2017 hold for California politics? We're talking with John Myers from the LA Times and Marisa Lagos from KQED. So Marisa, Governor Brown and the legislature, what are the big issues you think they're going to be focusing on going forward?
Well, I think a lot of it's going to be pushing back against Trump and whatever he's going to be doing around immigration and some of the other issues we've discussed. I think also, the budget is a big question mark this year after several years of sort of good budget news, given the uncertainty of the federal government. And
Governor Brown always warns about the finances.
Absolutely. But I think he's got a little bit more of a leg to stand on this year. And so, I think, watching what they decide to do around climate change, for example, whether they decide to pursue cap and trade, speaking of a 2/3 majority legislation, and then I think everybody's sort of just getting ready for what could come from Washington, and I think that's really going to sort of overwhelm anything else this year in a way.
So we're worrying about the recession, worrying about the Trump effect in California, what it means in terms of the state budget, going to slow down initiatives?
I think it could slow down all kinds of things. I mean, the reality is that the state's finances, to Marisa's point, are looking very good. I mean, there's an early analysis that suggests maybe about $1 billion that could be spent. Do you commit that $1 billion, though, when you may have to start plugging some holes under a Trump administration? The other thing, really quickly, Mark, I would point out, is that I think Democrats are aware that this election cycle was a revolt of the middle class who voted for Trump, some who wanted to have Sanders early on. And so what programs are they going to pursue in Sacramento that are going to be focused on the middle class? Not the poor and not the wealthy, but working class Californians. Do they need to have a conversation?
But could you argue that in California where Hillary Clinton did much better than Donald Trump? I mean, it's true nationally.
Yeah, but I think if you, but you know, I mean, I don't, no disrespect to Secretary Clinton's victory, but look at the dynamics of California already, where the Republican Party was already shrunk. Democrats already are ascendant. They have all of the statewide offices. All they hear from are Democrats in some ways.
Yeah, Marisa, let me ask you this. You know, Democrats now calling the shots in California. Of course, you got the congressional Republicans, Donald Trump. The Republicans clearly control the federal government. Some have suggested that California is going to take on Trump and the Republicans, kind of like what Texas did to Obama. So do you foresee California taking a Texas-sized approach?
I do, actually. I think we've already seen people say, don't mess with California, right? Suddenly we love everything that Texas
We want us to see, just like Texas always
exactly.
did, right?
I absolutely do, and I think, you know, the governor's pick for Attorney General was sort of fighting words in that respect, that we are going to see lawsuits, say, if they try to strip money from the state because of the sanctuary policies, or if they go after immigrants. You know, I think the Attorney General's office in many ways will lead that effort in court, and then we might see actually city attorneys and other folks at the local level follow suit.
So AG Becerra can have a pretty important role here.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, look at the Texas anecdote, right? The former Attorney General of Texas said, I'd get up in the morning, I sue Obama, I go home. I mean, that's what California can do. And isn't it fascinating, Mark, that we're flipping the discussion of states' rights versus federal government here? You know, California believed in a strong federal government when it was a Democratic White House, and now we're probably going to believe in a very strong states' rights system now that we are on the other end.
Absolutely. Actually, two of the cases that were brought to my attention when I was reporting out the issue of sanctuary funds and whether the federal government can actually take away money from jurisdictions over immigration policies was one case that was brought by sheriffs in rural Texas who didn't want to enforce some gun background check laws that the federal government had instated, and another one that was brought by a small business federation over Obamacare. And in both those cases, the high court said, you know what, you can punish jurisdictions to an extent, but you can't make them do your job, and you can't take away all their money just because they do one thing you don't like. And so I think it's going to be a fascinating embracing of those sort of red states values in a way.
John, let me ask you this. So winners and losers in 2016, how would you sum that up?
Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. Winner, Jerry Brown. I think Jerry Brown won in 2016. I mean, he wasn't on the ballot, but legislatively prior to the election, I think he did pretty good in terms of what he wanted. He beat back Prop 53, which you mentioned at one point, which was
that looked like it was going to pass.
Yeah, which would require a vote on revenue bonds, could have been trouble for high-speed rail or the Delta Water Project. Losers, I don't know. I think that I think in some environmental community, folks may not have gotten what they wanted out of the Capitol prior to the election. And then the mods, the business-aligned Democrats, are still pretty powerful. And that environmental Democrats versus business Democrats is a big, big fight in Sacramento.
Winners and losers?
Well, you know, I think Kamala Harris actually enters this administration with a really interesting role. I think that if she had come in under Hillary Clinton, she would have just been one of 50 and it would have been a different story. Now she has this chance to be a fighter, and I think you've already seen her meet with Elizabeth Warren. I think she has an opportunity to really make a mark that she wouldn't have had under a Democratic administration.
Well, I want to thank John Myers from the San Francisco Bureau of the LA Times and Marisa Lagos from KQED News for joining us. You also might want to catch their California Politics podcast each week. Very insightful.
Good plug. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. And if you want to keep up with state and local politics, you can also check out the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or logging us onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.